Well, hey, welcome back to another episode of Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So, we are, of course, big proponents of asking questions. That is kind of the MO of this entire series of programs. We think questions are invaluable. They are important for getting to know ourselves and getting to know others. But what happens when you get asked a question and kind of your defensiveness starts to perk up and there's some stuff going on inside of you that causes you to react in a way that's maybe even surprising to yourself and certainly surprising to the one who's asking the question. Wanted to address that a little bit. Where does that come from and how do you mitigate it?
If you're going to have a curious posture in life and you want to promote that in the people around you, especially in an organization, at work, in your family, with your kids, whatever your circle of influence is, it's not helpful if someone asks you a question and you get defensive, right?
Mhm.
The best way to shut something down when you're trying to promote it is to react not nicely when it happens, right? And I find even myself doing this. I mean, you and I have talked in the past. One of the reasons for doing this podcast is to create a curious posture and environment around us with you and I and our
Mhm.
families and our organizations. And so practicing that, and I found myself just this morning reacting is a better word, to a question in a defensive way. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's not going to help, right?
Mhm.
And as you opened up, I found myself asking, why did I even do that, right?
Yeah.
And why did I get defensive? I think there's a number of factors that come into play here, none the least of which is what is our current state of being,
Yeah.
right? You and I have talked in the past about not being hungry, angry, lonely, tired. You know, we can take care of ourselves if we're getting good sleep, if we're getting good physical exercise, if we're eating properly, if our blood sugar levels are proper, right? All
Mhm.
those kind of things, then we are going to be in a much better position to hear a question,
Sure.
but also, what is it that we're doing? What are we up to? Have we not maybe performed well? Have we mailed it in, so to speak, in one part of our project? And so when someone questions us about us, we get defensive. Are
Mhm.
we in a situation where we've done something that we think maybe the boss, maybe it's a little bit, we're watching a series right now where the guy's being a little bit of a rebel and he's doing something, hoping it works well so he can come back to his organization and say, look what I did, but it's not quite within the framework that the organization is setting up for him to do. So maybe if someone questions you and you're doing something like that, you're like, hey, 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 just kind of relax. Let me get this done and then I'll come back and tell you how great it was. Right? There's many, many reasons why we
Sure.
might be defensive. None of them, in my experience, are good.
Yeah. Well, and as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about myself and how I respond to questions sometimes. And I don't know that defensiveness is one that's super common to me, but fear is. And that speaks volumes about just kind of the things that I struggle with and where my headspace is at, that when somebody asks me a question, there's a fear factor involved. Like, are they mad at me? Did I do something wrong? Have
Oh.
I caused a problem in this situation? Right? In that insecurity that starts to bubble up when you get asked the question. And I think one of my least favorite questions of all time is, "Hey, do you have some time to talk?" When there's no context and there's no nothing, because I think I've had that question asked of me enough times, and it's been a really serious negative conversation that's come out of that, that now my default, like my emotional default is one of almost panic. When someone says out of the blue to me, "Hey, do you have a few minutes to talk?" And I'm like, "Oh gosh, what's gonna happen? What news am I gonna get dropped on me?" It's a really yucky feeling.
That's both, all of those points are very well taken. Starting with fear, and isn't defensiveness just a form of fear?
Mm,
What am I afraid of losing? What am I trying to prove and to whom? Et cetera. Those kinds of things are just versions of fear. Um, and then the insecurity part. Oh yeah. I mean, if especially, and again, this is one of those things that in various parts of our lives is going to be totally different. There might be
mm,
some parts of our lives we feel really good about and people questioning, yeah, let me tell you about that. maybe I'm very passionate about that. Hey, Birga, what does your organization do? You might, yes, please ask me
Mhm.
so that I can tell you. Um, Whereas, other parts of my life I don't feel as strong in, and I don't feel as knowledgeable, and I'm maybe just kind of winging it.
Yeah.
And so, and since I like to feel in control when someone asks me about it, then I don't like it. But the last thing you said about if someone says, "Do you have some time to talk?" My goodness, Birga, and I know that's a terrible one for you because you're a great listener, and I know a lot of people ask you,
Mm.
do you have time to talk? Because you're a good listener and you don't jump to advice. And so, what a great, and I think so. So if we have a set of responses that we've thought of beforehand, maybe this is one of those times when practicing ahead of time or thinking through something ahead of time might help.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a great practice for us to have. I think for myself and anybody else who really struggles with that kind of emotional flare up that happens when you get asked a question in that space between the end of their question and however you're going to respond, like there needs to be some degree of, I think, processing and really reflecting back. Why did I get to this point where this question triggers this emotion?
Mhm.
And so, I can think of an example even in our organization very recently where somebody said, "Hey, do you have some time to talk?" And there had been a series of, negative things that had happened in the workplace over the last days and weeks. And so, the response was, "Well, you're not going to resign, are you?" And then instant tears,
Wow.
and that's exactly what was about to happen.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so, it's these ways that we try to navigate our own emotions, our own fears, our insecurities. We might, respond in a way that we think is in jest, but then you kind of hit on the heart of the matter. So I don't know. There's so much in the art of asking questions. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, and the art of, as you're describing, receiving questions.
Yes. Yes.
So the asking and the receiving, and isn't that funny that we've hit on something that is true about everything from gift giving to criticism? It's in the delivery and in the receiving.
Yes.
And I think that that's an amazing one. And your that recent example is, and you're very perceptive and very intuitive, and you have a lot of empathy. So the fact that you discerned what the person was going to talk to you about is not surprising to me. But where I was going with that was, should we set expectations like, do you have some time to talk? I have 20 minutes.
Mm,
Because you never know whether something, do you have some time to talk, might be a quick response and a
right.
piece of advice. It takes you 3.5 seconds to, okay, this is going to take a couple of hours.
Right.
And I think that might be part of the
Hmm.
concern, right? It's part of the fear is, well, okay, what am I getting myself into here,
Yeah.
right? Including, a resignation. My goodness. So I think it's not so there have been some times in the past where there has been some trauma,
Hmm.
micro trauma to macro trauma,
Right.
that has happened in those situations where someone has asked you that in the past. So it's a trigger,
Yeah.
right? It's a trigger of emotions. And so when someone asks you that specific question, in between the question mark and your response, there's just a flood of stuff that comes
Yep.
into your head. That's a fascinating thing. And so if we were to write down what are the questions that people ask that elicit that response,
Hmm.
that trigger us, that could be very useful.
Yes. And I think as we're having interactions with family members or colleagues or whatever the situation may be, and you notice that as you ask a question, there is something that kind of washes across their face, you see a change in their body posture, something emotional has happened in you asking that question. I think take note of that. It's not your place to dig deep and to, get to the root of it, but it may be very helpful that if you're somebody that's asking, "Hey, do you have a few minutes of time to talk?" And you're seeing that kind of a response, a physical response from the person, to figure out in the future how to reframe it. Like, "Hey, do you have 5 minutes? I would like to discuss blank," right? To be as concrete as possible, filling in enough information to doesn't leave the person wondering or feeling a sense of panic or fear around what the subject matter is, but to be as transparent as possible might help kind of calm down some of those responses.
Yeah, that and what are we doing ourselves? I'm thinking as you're speaking about a specific time in my life where, I mean, and I'm not proud of this, but I sometimes wear on my sleeve whether I'm approachable or not,
Mm,
even though I'm in a public situation. So, there's a specific time at the top of every hour where I want to listen to 38 seconds of the news just to make sure I'm not missing something major. I mean, my parent company is selling off one of its divisions, right? And so I just want to know basically what's going on in my day, and so people in my household know that at the top of the hour for 38 seconds for the news on the radio, don't approach, dad, grandpa, whoever. And is that fair to the people around me? Should I go and find a place where I can be in a place of solitude to be able to do that so that I'm not in a public place? And it's not my place for everybody else to quiet down and for people not to be able to approach me during that time. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that should be a reasonable request, but what the more reasonable thing to do is probably for me to set up a situation where that's not going to happen.
mm,
But anyway, back to your way more relevant story where I want to dive into more is as you're asking a question, body language and watching the response of the person that you're asking it of. If you're seeing an emotional response all the way to trigger, what can you do to help in the situation?
mhm. Yeah. And sometimes the relationship is such that you can ask that very question. Like, hey, I noticed that there was a physical response when I asked you that. Did I make you uncomfortable? Did I say something in a way that caused you anxiety? I'd like to reframe the question in a way that, respects your feelings, your emotions. But, a lot of times it may be a more casual relationship and you don't have the opportunity to ask those more probing questions. So I think being discerning in the moment and also the determination of your level of connection is going to elicit either further prompting questions to help mitigate that situation or just cause an awareness and perhaps just to be thoughtful about the approach that you take the next time.
And that situational awareness is so key, as you're
Mhm,
saying, and if this is a loved one and you're noticing a sharp response, well, that might be a way to ask a question. If it's merely transactional, then it's not, right? I
mhm,
mean, you're not going to go ask somebody advice at Lowe's about a screw, and then you see a response and oh, really? What's going on with you, right? I mean, that's not right, not the appropriate time or place, but in our loved ones and the ones around us. So going back to that situational awareness and how situational aware are we? And what are we setting up in our lives with respect to our situations? And how can we receive questions well? And how can we ask questions well?
yeah, absolutely. I think those are good things to consider. And going back to that idea of there may have been a situation that you're just unaware of that causes a trigger when a particular phrase or way of questioning is presented. We've been talking about medical issues and, seeing doctors and all of the stuff. We've been talking about this for months now. And, again, talking about a present time situation where a request or a question elicits a response because of past traumas, when it's said, especially in a medical context, can I see you in my office? That's a much different thing we know now because of the seriousness of whatever the degree of conversation has to happen around a medical conversation. That in and of itself will elicit something. And, it's hard for me to say, hey, providers, you need to figure out a better way to do that. But, I think just for us to be aware and that when we have a question that's asked of us that does cause that sense of anxiety or nervousness, and there's a gap of time, how do we come around each other and help and encourage one another in that place? Because there's kind of a sense and a knowing that there's going to be some hard conversation that's going to take place or some hard information that's going to be presented to me. So how do I walk in peace as best as possible until we get to that place where that conversation is actually going to transpire?
Right. And how, yeah. And like you said, how do we help each other on the journey? And that's kind of one of the goals, I think, of this whole series is how
Yeah.
do we help each other on the
Yeah.
journey? And how do we, and this is a micro subset of that, which is how do we ask our questions well and how do we receive our questions well? And when someone is dealing with something that's heavy, and one of the first questions, of course, in that situation is, or one of the first things to discern whether that involves a question or not is, does this person want to talk about this at this point?
Mhm.
Right. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I know that with my own medical situations, I mean, I remember getting yelled at a few months ago because I had gone to the emergency room for something. And, it turned out to be a temporary thing and it was minor and we still don't know what it was, but it was fine. But then I got yelled at later for, wait, you went to the emergency room, you didn't tell me.
Mm.
Right. So sometimes people want to talk about things. Sometimes people don't want to talk about things. Sometimes that's situational based on timing. And sometimes it's just, oh, I didn't think anything of it. Right.
Mhm.
And so, and then setting that expectation, hey, next time I'd like for you to tell me, no matter how small it is. Okay, fine. But I think that setting the expectations and being situationally aware is one of the big things. And I know for me, I don't sit down enough and just sit in my quiet time and think, okay, this happened today. Who should know about it?
Mm. Mhm.
And that's not just medical issues. That's anything that happens,
Yeah.
especially in an organization. We all are in charge of what we're telling people, and we think we know the best thing to tell our boss, our
Yeah.
colleagues, and the people that work for us. We think we know exactly what we should say to them. How often do we sit and think, okay, what happened today or what happened this week that my boss would probably like to know and I'm
Mm.
just not telling them? It doesn't have to be nefarious. It's not like you're
Sure.
trying to keep something from them, but you know what? It might be good for they might have wanted to know that happened, right? And
Yeah.
so
That is such a good point that you bring up. And I think it really speaks to this grander sense of how do we build and encourage community. Because if you're in relationships where you feel either A, they don't care about the things in your life where maybe would be inclined to share because it was something important to you, but you feel like, they don't really care. It's not worth discussing it with them. Or conversely, if they have something in their life and feeling like you're not somebody who's a good listening ear, or you're not somebody who's going to give them the time and the attention that they believe that this situation warrants, that is a very quick way to break apart community. But conversely, that moment of, okay, this thing happened. Who do I need to share it with? Not to be obnoxious and say, let me share all my news with all of the people in the world, but this, to your point, this is impactful to me and potentially impactful to other people. How do I engage in conversation around this? How do I bring people into my space to have dialogue around this and to build community? Because that's really what it's about, is using questions, using information to exchange parts of our lives, our emotional responses, the way that the world impacts us and learning how it impacts others. That is what builds relationship.
yeah, and you make a great point. And maybe the last one before we summarize is because you can undershare or overshare, right?
Certainly.
Am I sharing this? What's my motivation for sharing this?
Yes.
Am I sharing this to get attention? Am I sharing this to say, oh, look what I did? Am I sharing this or am I oversharing on things that people don't have a need to know?
Right.
Just to build myself up or to do something else or to, like I said, get attention. There's a great TED talk by Ethan Hawke, an actor who
Mhm.
says, getting attention is if whenever I'm in a situation where I'm trying to get attention, it turns out badly. When
Mm.
I'm paying attention, even to other actors, in a situation and it becomes a true collaboration, that's where greatness occurs. That's where things happen. So his whole point is pay attention versus get attention. And so this is a minor sub point here, but basically we want to be able to ask questions well, receive questions well, not get defensive, try to understand why people are asking questions, try to understand how people are receiving questions,
Mm.
and then think about what information should we be sharing so that people can or cannot ask questions as a result, and then what's my motivation behind that sharing and that questioning.
Yeah. No, I think those are all fantastic points, and I love that. Pay attention instead of, get attention.
Mhm.
And man, I own that. Like I have oftentimes been involved in a conversation where I do, like I want to toot my own horn, right? I've got these things that I've done that I want people to know. And so in my presentation or in my way that I'm interacting with somebody, I'm probably looking for attention rather than paying attention. But
Mhm.
what an impactful phrase. And that if I am posturing myself in that space of curiosity in the moment and I'm choosing to pay attention and use my senses to look and observe and really focus in on the other person, what a difference that makes in the richness and the fullness of conversation for both parties.
That's right. And that's the key is what can we do to foster an environment where people are paying attention rather than getting attention. And part of the way to do that is to pay proper attention. A lot of people try to get attention because they feel like no one's hearing them.
Yes.
And so now you can't, that's also a balance, right? You know, I
Mm,
love that word. You don't need to overpay attention or enable people who are attention seekers.
yeah.
On the other hand, we have to pay enough attention to where people aren't seeking attention just because they feel no one's listening to them.
Yeah. These are all wonderful things to think on. And I certainly hope that, as those of you that are listening and watching are kind of thinking through your own scenarios, that it's given you some food for thought around, okay, what does this look like as I translate this into my workplace, into my family life, into my social setting? Because ultimately that is what this is for, is to help us to really ask questions of ourselves and others, to build community and to nurture relationships. So as always, we appreciate you listening in and love your feedback. So as always, want to point you over to the comment section over on the YouTube page, or of course you can drop us a direct message through our website, which is curiositynotjudgment.com. Any closing thoughts?
No, just as we move forward, thinking about situational awareness and how we ask our questions and how we receive our questions.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll catch up with y'all next time.
Take care.